The woman standing in the doorway of Jake Morgan's ranch house looked like trouble wrapped in calico, and he knew it the moment her green eyes met his across the dusty threshold on that scorching August afternoon in 1882. "I need your help," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm the one they blame for the bank robbery in Copper Creek." Jake had been leaning against the doorframe, hat pushed back on his head, sweat dampening his shirt from a long day working cattle. At 26, he'd seen his share of desperate people rolling through this part of New Mexico territory. But something about this woman made him straighten up and pay attention. She couldn't have been more than 23 or 24, with auburn hair escaping from beneath a plain bonnet and dust coating her traveling dress. "That's so," he drawled, not moving to let her in just yet. "Word came through yesterday that they're looking for a woman who worked at the bank. Said she helped 3 men clean out the vault." "My name is Caroline Whitmore," she said, lifting her chin. "And I did work at the bank, but I didn't help anyone rob it. They used me, made it look like I was part of it, and now the sheriff has a warrant for my arrest. If they catch me, they'll hang me without a trial." Jake studied her face, looking for signs of deception. His father had taught him to read people before he died 5 years back, leaving Jake with this 1,000-acre spread and the responsibility of keeping it running. He'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were telling him this woman was terrified but truthful. "Why come to me?" he asked. "Your ranch is the only place between Copper Creek and the border where I thought I might find someone decent," Caroline said. "I asked in town before everything happened. People said Jake Morgan was fair-minded and honest. I'm asking you to listen to my story before you turn me over to the law." Against his better judgment, Jake stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. His ranch hand, Miguel, was out checking the north pasture and wouldn't be back until sundown, which gave them privacy. Caroline walked into the modest parlor, and Jake noticed how she swayed slightly on her feet. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "Yesterday morning," she admitted. He pointed to a chair. "Sit, I'll get you something." While Caroline sank into the wooden chair, Jake went to the kitchen and put together cold beef, bread, and water from the pump. When he returned, he found her staring at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. He set the plate and cup on the table beside her. "Eat first, then talk," he said. Caroline looked up at him with such gratitude that something shifted in his chest. She ate slowly, as though forcing herself not to devour the food too quickly, and Jake waited patiently. When she finished, she drank the entire cup of water and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I haven't met much kindness since this started." Jake pulled up another chair and sat facing her. "Tell me what happened." Caroline took a deep breath. "I've worked at Copper Creek Bank for 2 years, ever since my parents died and I needed to support myself. Mr. Henderson, the bank manager, hired me to keep records and help customers. 3 weeks ago, a man came in asking about opening an account. His name was Roy Garrett, and he was charming, well-dressed, and seemed legitimate. He came back several times, always asking me questions about the bank's procedures, hours, and security. I thought he was just being thorough." "You didn't suspect anything?" Jake asked. "I was foolish," Caroline said bitterly. "He paid attention to me, complimented me, and I was lonely enough to enjoy it. He asked if I'd have dinner with him, and I said yes. We met twice outside the bank, and he seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. Then last Monday, everything changed." Jake leaned forward, listening intently as Caroline continued her story. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, though he could hear the pain underneath. "I arrived at work early that morning like I always do. Mr. Henderson asked me to organize some files in the back room, which wasn't unusual. But while I was there, I heard shouting and gunshots. By the time I ran out, 3 men were holding everyone at gunpoint. One of them was Roy Garrett, but he looked completely different. Cold, cruel. He pointed his gun at me and told me to open the vault." "Did you?" Jake asked. "I had no choice," Caroline said, her eyes filling with tears. "He said he'd shoot Mr. Henderson if I didn't cooperate, so I opened it and they cleaned it out. Took nearly $15,000. But before they left, Roy did something I didn't understand at the time. He handed me an envelope and said loudly so everyone could hear, "Here's your cut, sweetheart. Thanks for the help." Then he kissed my cheek and they rode out. Jake felt anger stirring in his gut. "He set you up." "Exactly," Caroline said. "When the sheriff came, everyone said I'd helped them. They said I'd been meeting with Roy, which was true, and that I'd willingly opened the vault. Mr. Henderson tried to defend me at first, saying I'd acted under duress, but then they opened the envelope Roy had given me. It had $500 inside and a note that said, 'Thanks for everything, Caroline. Couldn't have done it without you.' It was written to look like I'd been planning this with them all along." "Where's the money now?" Jake asked. "The sheriff took it as evidence," Caroline said. "Not that it mattered. Everyone had already made up their minds. They arrested me and put me in a cell while they waited for the circuit judge to arrive. But I knew I wouldn't get a fair trial. The whole town wanted someone to blame, and I was convenient. So 2 nights ago, when the deputy fell asleep at his desk, I slipped out. The cell lock was old and loose, and I'd been working on it since they locked me up. I took a horse from the livery and rode as hard as I could." Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the vast expanse of his land. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. He believed her story, which surprised him. Maybe it was the genuine fear and frustration in her voice, or maybe it was the fact that her tale was too elaborate to be a lie. Either way, he found himself wanting to help her. "You're asking me to risk everything," he said without turning around. "If I harbor you and the law finds out, I'll lose this ranch and probably wind up in jail myself." "I know," Caroline said quietly, "and I wouldn't blame you if you rode into town right now and turned me in. But I'm innocent, Mr. Morgan, and I don't know how to prove it on my own. Those men are still out there with the money and nobody's looking for them because they think they already have the guilty party." Jake turned to face her. "I didn't say I wouldn't help you. I just wanted you to know what we're both risking." Hope flared in Caroline's eyes. "You believe me?" "I do," Jake said. "And I think I know where we might start looking for your Roy Garrett and his partners." Over the next hour, as the sun set and the house grew dim, Jake lit lamps and they talked through what Caroline remembered about Roy and the other 2 men. She described them in detail. Roy was tall and dark-haired, with a scar near his left ear that he'd tried to hide with long hair. The other 2 were rougher-looking, one with a limp and the other with a distinctive tattoo of a snake on his right hand. "I've heard of men matching those descriptions," Jake said thoughtfully. "There's a gang that operates between here and Texas. They've hit banks and stagecoaches from El Paso to Santa Fe. The law's been after them for 3 years, but they're smart. They plan carefully and they disappear completely after each job." "How do you know about them?" Caroline asked. "I used to ride with a marshal before I took over the ranch full-time," Jake explained. "Helped track outlaws when they needed extra men. The leader of this gang supposedly has a way with women, uses them to get information before jobs. Sounds like your Roy Garrett fits the pattern." Caroline's face paled. "So I was just a tool to him." "Don't take it personal," Jake said, though his voice was gentle. "Men like that don't think of other people as real, they're just marks to be used, but knowing who they are gives us an advantage. If we can find them and prove they set you up, we can clear your name." "How?" Caroline asked. "They could be anywhere by now." Jake smiled grimly. "Actually, I don't think they've gone far. These men are predictable in one way. They always hide out after a big job in places where no one would think to look. There's an abandoned mining camp about 30 miles northeast of here, up in the mountains. It's remote, has water, and provides good cover. If I were running from a bank robbery, that's where I'd go." Caroline stood up, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "When can we leave?" "We can't," Jake said. "I can't. You need to stay here where it's safe while I scout the area." "Absolutely not," Caroline said firmly. "This is my life we're talking about, Mr. Morgan. I won't sit here hiding while you risk yourself for me. Besides, I can identify Roy and the others with certainty. You need me." Jake started to argue, but something in Caroline's expression stopped him. There was steel beneath her fear, a determination that reminded him of his mother, who'd helped his father build this ranch from nothing and defended it against everything the harsh land threw at them. He realized that Caroline Whitmore was stronger than she looked and that she'd earned the right to fight for her own freedom. "All right," he said, "but we do this smart. We leave before dawn, take supplies for 3 days, and we don't engage unless we have no choice. Our goal is to gather evidence and find witnesses who can testify on your behalf." "Agreed, agreed," Caroline said. That night, Caroline slept in Jake's parents' old room while he took the small bedroom he'd used since giving up the larger space after his father died. He lay awake for a long time, thinking about the woman down the hall and the risk he was taking. He barely knew her, yet he felt compelled to help her in a way that went beyond simple decency. There was something about Caroline that drew him in, made him want to protect her and prove her innocence. He told himself it was just the right thing to do, but deep down he suspected it was more than that. They rose before sunrise, and Jake saddled 2 horses while Caroline changed into men's clothing he'd found in an old trunk. His younger brother's clothes from before he'd left for California fit her reasonably well, though she had to roll up the sleeves and trouser legs. With her hair tucked under a hat, she could pass for a young man from a distance, which might help if they encountered anyone on the trail. Miguel returned just as they were preparing to leave, and Jake took him aside to explain the situation. The older man listened without interruption, his weathered face thoughtful. "You're doing the right thing, patron," Miguel said finally, "but be careful. Men who would frame an innocent woman won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in their way." "I know," Jake said. "Keep the ranch running while I'm gone. If we're not back in 5 days, ride to town and tell the marshal what I've told you." Miguel nodded gravely, then surprised Jake by adding, "The lady has honest eyes. I hope you can prove her innocence." They rode out as the first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains, heading northeast toward the abandoned mining camp Jake had mentioned. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed, the desert scrub giving way to pine forests and rocky outcroppings. They stopped occasionally to rest the horses and check their direction, using landmarks Jake remembered from previous trips into this country. As they rode, they talked. Caroline told him about growing up in St. Louis, how her father had been a schoolteacher and her mother a seamstress. They'd moved west when she was 17, hoping for better opportunities, but her father had caught pneumonia during their first winter in New Mexico and never recovered. Her mother had died 6 months later, some said of a broken heart. "That's when I learned how hard the world can be for a woman alone," Caroline said. "No one wanted to hire me for anything respectable. They assumed I'd end up working in a saloon or worse. Mr. Henderson took a chance on me, and I worked hard to prove I deserved that chance. Now all of that is gone." "We'll get it back," Jake said with more confidence than he felt. He shared his own story as they rode, telling her about building the ranch with his father, about his mother's death from cholera when he was 20, and his father's death in a riding accident 2 years later. He spoke of the loneliness of running the ranch alone, of the satisfaction he found in the work, but also the emptiness that came with having no one to share it with. "Why haven't you married?" Caroline asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, that was too forward." "No, it's all right," Jake said. "I guess I never found someone who understood this life. Most women want to move to town, have society and neighbors close by. I need the open space, the freedom. My parents had that understanding between them, that partnership. I always figured I'd rather be alone than settle for less than what they had." Caroline was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "That's not foolish at all. That's knowing what you want and refusing to compromise it." Their eyes met, and Jake felt something pass between them, a recognition that both surprised and unsettled him. He quickly looked away and urged his horse forward, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. They reached the outskirts of the mining camp by late afternoon on the second day. Jake had them stop while they were still hidden in the tree line, and he studied the area through his father's old spyglass. The camp consisted of about 15 dilapidated buildings scattered around what had once been the mine entrance, now collapsed and overgrown. Most of the structures looked abandoned, but as he watched, he spotted smoke rising from one of the larger buildings near the center of the camp. "Someone's there," he murmured, handing the spyglass to Caroline. She looked through it, scanning the camp carefully. Suddenly she stiffened. "There," she whispered urgently. "That man coming out of the building with the smoke, that's one of them, the one with the limp." Jake took the spyglass back and focused on the figure. Sure enough, the man walked with a pronounced limp, favoring his left leg. He was carrying firewood, which he stacked beside the building before disappearing back inside. "We've found them," Jake said. "Now we need to figure out how many are in there and if they still have the money." They made camp a mile back in the forest, choosing a spot with good cover and a small stream for water. As darkness fell, Jake told Caroline to stay put while he crept closer to the mining camp to observe. She started to protest, but he cut her off firmly. "You said you'd follow my lead," he reminded her. "I can move quieter alone, and if something goes wrong, I need you safe to ride for help. Please, Caroline, trust me on this." She finally nodded, though he could see she didn't like it. Jake checked his rifle and revolver, then slipped into the darkness, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent years hunting in these mountains. It took him nearly an hour to work his way close enough to the occupied building to hear voices. He positioned himself behind a fallen timber and waited, watching and listening. 3 men sat around a table inside, visible through a window that had lost most of its glass. Jake recognized the man with the limp from earlier, and as the others moved, he caught sight of the snake tattoo on one man's hand. The third man had his back to the window, but when he turned his head, Jake saw the scar near his left ear that Caroline had described. Roy Garrett. They were drinking and playing cards, their voices carrying in the still night air. Jake strained to hear their conversation. "Should have seen her face when I handed her that envelope," Roy was saying with a laugh. "Stupid girl probably still doesn't understand what happened." "You think they'll hang her?" asked the man with the tattoo. "Don't much care," Roy said. "By the time anyone figures out she was innocent, we'll be in Mexico living like kings. $15,000 split 3 ways, not bad for a week's work." The man with the limp dealt another hand of cards. "Still think we should have cleared out right away instead of holing up here. And ride straight into every lawman between here and the border," Roy said dismissively. "No, we wait another week until the heat dies down, then we split up and meet in Juarez. It's safer this way." Jake had heard enough. He carefully backed away from his position and made his way back to where Caroline was waiting. She jumped up when he appeared, her face anxious in the moonlight. "They're all there," he reported quietly. "All 3 of them, sitting around drinking and talking about how clever they are. And Caroline, they admitted to framing you. I heard Roy say it himself." Caroline's legs seemed to give way and she sat down hard on a log. "Thank God," she whispered. "But how does that help us? It's not like we can arrest them ourselves." "No," Jake agreed, sitting beside her. "But we can track them when they leave and we can make sure we have witnesses to back up your story. What we need is evidence that connects them to the robbery. The money would be ideal, but failing that, we need someone official to hear them confess." "The nearest marshal is in Socorro," Caroline said. "That's more than 50 miles from here." Jake thought for a moment. "There's a telegraph office in Pine Ridge about 15 miles south. We could wire the marshal from there, have him meet us with a deputy or 2. If we can keep watch on the gang until the law arrives, we can lead them right to the thieves." "Won't they have moved on by then?" Caroline asked. "Not according to what I heard," Jake said. "Roy said they're waiting another week before heading to Mexico. That gives us time." They decided that Caroline would ride to Pine Ridge at first light while Jake stayed to watch the camp and make sure the outlaws didn't leave unexpectedly. Caroline protested again, not wanting to leave him alone, but Jake insisted it made more sense for her to go since she could identify herself to the marshal and explain the situation directly. Besides, he added with a slight smile, if they spot me, they'll just see a cowboy who wandered too close. If they spot you, they might recognize you, and then we've lost our advantage. Caroline reluctantly agreed. They spent the rest of the night taking turns keeping watch, and when Jake wasn't on guard duty, he found himself watching Caroline sleep. Even exhausted and dressed in men's clothing with dirt on her face, she was beautiful. More than that, she was brave and determined, qualities he admired deeply. He realized he was falling for her, this woman he'd known for less than 3 days, and the realization should have scared him but somehow didn't. When Caroline woke just before dawn, she found Jake brewing coffee over their small fire. He handed her a cup and some jerky for breakfast, and they ate in companionable silence as the sky slowly lightened. "Be careful," Jake said as Caroline prepared to mount her horse. "Ride straight to Pine Ridge, send the telegram, and then come right back. Don't take any chances." Caroline looked at him for a long moment, then impulsively reached up and touched his cheek. "You be careful too," she said softly. "I've already lost everything else. I don't want to lose you too." Before Jake could respond, she swung into the saddle and rode off toward the south, disappearing into the morning mist that hung between the trees. Jake stood watching until he couldn't see her anymore, then turned back toward the mining camp to continue his surveillance. The next 2 days passed slowly. Jake maintained his hidden position, watching the 3 outlaws as they lounged around their hideout, occasionally venturing out to hunt or gather firewood but mostly just waiting. He saw them count the money once, spreading stacks of bills across the table and dividing it into 3 equal piles. The sight of it made his blood boil, knowing that money had cost Caroline her reputation and nearly her life. Caroline returned late on the 2nd day, riding hard and looking relieved to find Jake safe. "The marshal is coming," she said breathlessly. "I sent the telegram and waited for a response. Marshal Dawson said he'd ride out immediately with 2 deputies. They should be here by tomorrow afternoon." "Good work," Jake said. "The gang hasn't moved. They're getting complacent, drinking more every night. That'll work in our favor when the marshal arrives." That night, as they kept watch together, Caroline moved closer to Jake as the temperature dropped. Without thinking, he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him. They sat that way for a long time, watching stars wheel overhead and listening to the sounds of the forest around them. "Jake," Caroline said quietly, "whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know I'm grateful. You believed me when no one else would, and you've risked everything to help me. I won't forget that. Whatever happens tomorrow, we're going to clear your name," Jake said firmly, "and then you'll be free to go wherever you want, do whatever you want." Caroline was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What if I don't want to go anywhere?" Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" She pulled back slightly so she could look at him in the darkness. "I mean that in the past few days, I've felt more alive and more myself than I have in years. Even with everything that's happened, even scared and running, I've felt like I matter. Like I'm not just surviving but actually living, and that's because of you." Jake cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing her cheek. "Caroline, I've been alone for a long time by choice. But these past days with you, I've realized I wasn't choosing to be alone. I was just waiting for the right person to come along. Someone strong enough to love this life, brave enough to fight for what matters, and real enough to be a true partner." "Someone like me," Caroline whispered. "Exactly like you," Jake said, and then he kissed her. It was a gentle kiss at first, tentative and sweet, but it quickly deepened as years of loneliness on both sides found an answer in each other. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard and Caroline was smiling. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Jake Morgan," she said. "I know I'm falling in love with you, Caroline Whitmore," he replied. "And once we get through tomorrow, I'm going to spend every day proving it to you." They held each other through the rest of the night, and when dawn came, they were ready to face whatever happened next together. Marshal Dawson arrived with his deputies shortly after noon. just as Jake had predicted. He was a grizzled man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. Jake and Caroline met him a mile from the mining camp and quickly explained the situation, with Caroline giving a detailed account of the robbery and her framing, and Jake describing what he'd observed over the past few days. The marshal listened carefully, asking pointed questions and studying Caroline's face as she answered. Finally, he nodded. "I remember hearing about this case. The sheriff in Copper Creek sent out wanted posters." "But your story makes sense, Miss Whitmore, and I've been after this gang for 3 years. If they're really holed up where you say, we're going to end this today." They made their plan quickly. Jake would lead them to the camp and show them the positions of the buildings. The marshal and his deputies would approach from 3 sides, cutting off escape routes, while Jake and Caroline stayed back at a safe distance. The goal was to take the outlaws alive so they could testify and clear Caroline's name completely. Everything went according to plan until the shooting started. The marshal called for the outlaws to surrender just as they were emerging from their building, and instead of complying, Roy Garrett drew his gun and fired. The deputies returned fire, and suddenly, the quiet mining camp exploded into chaos. Jake pulled Caroline behind a large boulder and told her to stay down, but he could see the fear in her eyes, not for herself but for him. The gunfight lasted only a few minutes but felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, the man with the limp was dead, shot while trying to flee. The man with the tattoo was wounded in the shoulder, and Roy Garrett had been captured unhurt but furious, cursing the marshal and his deputies as they bound his hands. Marshal Dawson searched the building and emerged with the stolen bank money still mostly intact. He counted it carefully, then recorded the amount in his notebook. Turning to Caroline, he said, "This evidence, combined with what I've witnessed here and what these men will testify to under oath, should be more than enough to clear your name, Miss Whitmore. I'll need you to come to Socorro to make a full statement, but I don't believe you'll face any charges." Caroline sagged against Jake in relief, and he held her tightly, feeling her shake with reaction to everything that had happened. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe now, you're free." They traveled to Socorro the next day, and Caroline spent 2 full days giving her statement and answering questions. True to his word, Marshal Dawson worked to clear her name, and within a week, the territorial governor himself issued a pardon and a formal apology. The bank in Copper Creek sent word that they wanted Caroline to return to her position, with a raise, and the title of assistant manager as compensation for her ordeal. Jake and Caroline were staying at a hotel in Socorro while the legal matters were resolved, maintaining separate rooms to preserve Caroline's reputation, though they spent every possible moment together. On the evening that Caroline received word of her full exoneration, Jake asked her to take a walk with him along the river that ran through town. "You've got your life back," Jake said as they walked hand in hand in the twilight. "Your name is cleared, you've got your job back if you want it, and you're free to go anywhere, do anything. So I need to ask you something important, and I need you to answer honestly." Caroline stopped walking and turned to face him, moonlight reflecting in her eyes. "What is it?" Jake took both her hands in his. "I love you, Caroline. I know it's been less than 2 weeks since you showed up at my door, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love your strength, your courage, your kindness, and your spirit. I love who I am when I'm with you. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you every single day that you made the right choice in trusting me." "Jake," Caroline whispered, tears starting to fall. "Let me finish," he said gently. "I know the ranch is isolated and the life is hard. I know you could go back to Copper Creek or even to St. Louis and have an easier time of it. But if you're willing, if you think you could love that life and love me, then I'm asking you to marry me. Come back to the ranch as my wife, as my partner in everything. Help me build something lasting and real. Raise a family with me if we're blessed with children. Grow old with me on that land that I love. Will you, Caroline? Will you marry me? Caroline was crying openly now, but she was also smiling. "Yes," she said through her tears. "Yes, Jake, I'll marry you. I love you too, more than I thought possible. And that ranch, that life you're offering, that's everything I want. Not because it's safe or easy, but because it's real and it's ours and it's with you." Jake picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at once. When he set her down, he kissed her with all the love and promise and hope he felt, and she kissed him back with equal passion. They were married 3 weeks later in a small church in Socorro, with Marshall Dawson giving Caroline away and Miguel serving as Jake's best man. Caroline wore a simple white dress she'd bought with the reward money the bank had given her for recovering most of their stolen funds. She'd never looked more beautiful. After the ceremony, they rode back to the ranch together as husband and wife. Caroline had sent a letter to the bank in Copper Creek, thanking them for their offer, but explaining that she'd found a new life and new purpose. She'd kept her promise to Jake and was ready to embrace everything that came with being a rancher's wife. The first year of their marriage was both challenging and wonderful. Caroline proved to be a natural at ranch work, learning to ride well, helping with the cattle, and managing the household with efficiency and grace. She planted a garden that flourished despite the harsh climate, and she made the ranch house into a real home with curtains and rugs, and the kind of small touches that Jake had never known he was missing. They faced hard times together, including a drought that first summer and a harsh winter that followed. But they also found joy in the simple rhythms of ranch life, in the satisfaction of hard work done well, and most of all in each other. Jake had never known he could be so happy, so completely content with his life and his choices. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Jake's father, was born in the spring of 1884. Caroline labored through a long night with Jake by her side, and when the baby finally arrived, healthy and squalling, Jake wept with joy. Holding his son for the first time, with Caroline exhausted but radiant in their bed, he felt a completeness he'd never imagined possible. "He's perfect," Caroline whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. "Just like his mother," Jake said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter they named Rose, and the house rang with the sounds of children playing and laughing. Miguel, now getting on in years, became like a grandfather to the children, teaching them Spanish songs and telling them stories of his youth in Mexico. As the years passed, Jake and Caroline built the ranch into one of the most successful operations in the territory. They earned a reputation for fair dealing and honest work, and their home became known as a place where travelers could always find a meal and a bed. Caroline started a small school on the ranch, teaching not only her own children, but also the children of neighboring ranchers and the Mexican families who worked on nearby spreads. On their 10th anniversary, Jake took Caroline back to the spot by the river in Socorro where he'd proposed. They stood hand in hand, older now and marked by the years of hard work, but more in love than ever. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked quietly. "Choosing this life instead of something easier?" Caroline looked up at him, her green eyes as bright as the day she'd first appeared at his door. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "Every hard thing we've faced together. Every joy has been sweeter because we've shared it. You saved my life, Jake Morgan, but more than that, you gave me a life worth living. I love you now more than I did on our wedding day, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today." Jake pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling profound gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought this remarkable woman into his world. "I love you too, Caroline. Always and forever." They had 3 more children over the years, another son and 2 more daughters. The ranch continued to prosper, and as New Mexico moved toward statehood, Jake and Caroline became respected members of their community. They never forgot the dramatic way their love story began, but it became just one chapter in a much longer tale of partnership, devotion, and enduring love. On quiet evenings, when the children were grown and had families of their own, Jake and Caroline would sit on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the land they'd built together. Caroline's hair had gone silver, and Jake's face was weathered and lined, but the love in their eyes when they looked at each other was as young and fresh as it had been that first moment of their kiss under the stars. "Do you remember," Caroline would say, "when I showed up at your door scared and desperate, asking a stranger to believe my story?" "Best decision I ever made," Jake would reply, taking her hand. "Believing you, loving you, building this life with you." And Caroline would smile and lean her head on his shoulder, and they would sit in perfect contentment, grateful for every moment they'd been given together, knowing that their love story, which began with a bank robbery and a desperate plea for help, had become something beautiful and lasting and true. Their grandchildren loved to hear the tale of how their grandparents met, always begging for the story at family gatherings. Caroline would tell it with dramatic flair, describing the fear and desperation of being falsely accused, while Jake would add the details of tracking the real thieves and the showdown at the mining camp. But the part they both loved telling most was the ending, how love could grow even in the hardest circumstances, how trust and faith in each other could overcome any obstacle, and how choosing to believe in someone when no one else would could change two lives forever. Thomas, their eldest, eventually took over the running of the ranch, proving to be as capable and fair-minded as his father. Rose became a teacher in town, carrying on her mother's passion for education. The younger children found their own paths, but they all stayed close, drawn back regularly to the ranch that represented not just property but the legacy of love and partnership their parents had built. Jake and Caroline lived long lives, blessed with health and happiness well into their 70s. When Jake finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Caroline was holding his hand, and his last words were, "Thank you for saying yes." Caroline followed him 2 years later, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of whom carried forward the values of honesty, courage, and devotion that Jake and Caroline had exemplified. Her last words were a whispered, "I love you," meant for the husband she would soon be joining. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and the dates of their long lives. But the true monument to their love was the thriving ranch below, the strong family they'd created, and the countless lives they'd touched with their kindness and integrity. The story of Caroline Whitmore, who was falsely accused of bank robbery, and Jake Morgan, the cowboy who believed her and found the real thieves, became a legend in that part of New Mexico. It was a story about justice and courage, but more than that, it was a story about love, about two people who found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something that lasted not just a lifetime but generations. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the pines and the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, those who knew the story swore they could still feel Jake and Caroline's presence on that land, their love as much a part of the ranch as the soil and stone, enduring and eternal, a testament to the power of faith, trust, and a love that conquered all obstacles.